Okay. And I'm going to share my screen.
Could you please mute everybody if it's not done already?
Yeah. Can someone give me a clue how I do that? I'm not sure how to do it.
Go to the participants, and if you go all the way down, you can mute the, as hosts, you can mute
all.
everybody.
Yes, I see it. Thank you. Okay, that should mute everybody. I see somebody who's not muted. I don't know why. Click on that again. Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Now, PowerPoint, share. Okay. Now let's get the slideshow going. Beginning. Okay. Okay. Today's topic is what I call rivers that Maryland shares with other states, of which there are two major ones, the Susquehanna River and the Potomac River. And let's look at where they are. Okay, here is the geology map that we've seen before, but I think it's very helpful to sort of orient you. And by the way, I'll repeat a suggestion that John Meredith made. If you have a Maryland map, you might want to open it and have it in front of you so you can kind of have a look at, where on the map we're talking about while the class is going on. So the Potomac is actually the boundary line, the southern boundary line of all of this part of Maryland, all the way from the northwest corner to the Chesapeake Bay. And the Susquehanna is this very short little stretch of river up in the Piedmont and crossing the fall line into the coastal plain. And here is a map of the rivers of Maryland. Rivers, creeks, lakes, and bays, actually, is the title. And the Susquehanna, again, is up here in the northeast corner. And the Potomac is here. And almost all of these rivers following this line flow into the Potomac, which then, of course, empties into the Chesapeake at its mouth. So first we'll talk about the Susquehanna. The name, like many of our rivers in Maryland, is Native American. And a gentleman named Hamel Kenny, who wrote a book called Place Names of Maryland, Their Origin and Meaning, thinks that the most likely meaning of the word is smooth flowing stream. And the Native Americans living in this area were the Susquehannocks, and that's where the name of the river comes from. This is the watershed of the Susquehanna River. It drains 27,510 square miles, which is an area almost as big as the state of South Carolina. And as you can see from this map, the watershed extends up into a large chunk of eastern Pennsylvania and all the way into New York. The headwaters are up here, actually near Cooperstown, New York. So this is a very large drainage area. It's the country's 16th largest river, and it's the largest river that flows into the Atlantic that is entirely contained within the United States. From the headwaters up near Cooperstown, it flows for 444 miles down to the mouth, where it flows into the Chesapeake at Havre de Grace, which is down here. So if most of the Susquehanna is not in Maryland, why are we even talking about it? Well, only the last 15 miles of the 444 miles of the river are in Maryland, but the river provides about half of the total inflow of fresh water to the bay. So it's critically important to the Chesapeake Bay. The ancient Susquehanna looked like this. It flowed all the way to the bay. And the dotted lines on this map represent the current area of the Chesapeake Bay. During the sea rise of the last glacial melting, which was between 3,000 and 8,000 years ago, the shallow valley flooded. So geologically, the bay is actually called the Drowned Valley of the lower Susquehanna. What's left of the old river is a deep channel that flows down the middle of the bay, and that is used as the shipping channel because of the depth. Much of the rest of the bay is quite shallow. The average depth of the bay is only 21 feet, and there are many areas that are less than 6 feet deep. The deepest part of the bay is off something called Bloody Point, which is near Annapolis on the southern end of Kent Island. So when John Smith explored the Susquehanna in 1608, it was part of his travels up and down the Chesapeake, and the area impressed him. This is a quote from his journals. Quote, "Heaven and earth seemed never to have agreed better to frame a place for man's commodious and delightful habitation." So he really thought this was a good potential place to live. And of course, the many colonists who followed him, took his advice. He met one of the tribes of the native Susquehannocks and described them in his journal as well. So the first European settlement on the river was at the river's mouth, and it happened in 1658, a few years after the settlement of Maryland. And the river was a barrier to travel between Maryland and points north. It still is. So first they had a ferry, and the town where the ferry started was called Susquehanna Lower Ferry. There was also an upper ferry. And this is a historical marker describing that there was a ferry established in 1695, and many men used this ferry, and soldiers of the war between the states, which is what I grew up calling the Civil War. That's what they call it in many of Maryland's historical markers, which surprised me. And eventually, Susquehanna Lower Ferry was renamed Havre de Grace. When the Marquis de Lafayette saw the town, it said it reminded him of the port of Le Havre in France. So it's a French name, but that's not how Marylanders pronounce it. And I have a funny story. My husband once picked up a couple of hitchhikers who were Quebecois, French speakers, and they saw the sign as they were coming down toward the river. And they said, Havre de Grace, what a beautiful name for a town. But that's not how Marylanders pronounce it. And this is the promenade in Havre de Grace. It's a very pretty town with a lot of amenities. And this is the point where the river meets the bay. And the promenade gives you a view of that place. There's an interesting museum in the town called the Havre de Grace Decoy and Wildlife Art Museum. I guess that's the full title. Oh no, it's called the Havre de Grace Decoy Museum, but this is a poster for the Decoy and Wildlife Art Festival that the museum holds. They hold it every year in the spring. Had interesting exhibits about duck decoys and duck hunting on the Susquehanna Flats, which we'll talk about soon. And so this is one of the many interesting things that go on in the town. Well, the ferry was eventually replaced with a bridge, and the current one from the town of Havre de Grace is the Thomas Hayden Memorial Bridge. It carries US 40 across the Susquehanna, and it is named in honor of Thomas Hayden, who was a state delegate from Harford County and held various positions in state government. Most people who travel the Northeast Corridor follow I-95, which crosses the Susquehanna on the Millard Tidings Bridge, a little further upstream, also named for a longtime senator from Maryland. And a little while ago, there was a nice detour where you could avoid the toll on the I-95 bridge. And the way this worked is you bought a $5 decal for the Hayden Bridge that was good for a whole year. So you could, no matter if you crossed the river a number of times, you avoided the I-95 toll. But apparently they figured out that people were using the decal to avoid the toll, and a little while ago they stopped issuing it. We used it quite a few times. And I imagine it was quite a bargain if you were commuting, say, from Harford or Cecil County to somewhere across the river. So in the 19th century, excuse me, the Susquehanna was a trade route carrying products shipped down from the interior, from Pennsylvania and even New York, with crops like farm crops and timber, and also coal. Whatever was left of this shipping trade ended in 1928, and that is when the Conowingo Dam was built, a little upstream from where this picture is, which blocked navigation upstream from the Chesapeake Bay. And this is a picture of the Conowingo Dam from down below the dam. The Conowingo takes US 1 across the Susquehanna River. The highway runs along the top of the dam. It is about 10 miles upstream from Havre de Grace, and it is one of the largest non-federal hydroelectric dams in the country. It supplies hydroelectric power to some parts of the area. It supplies cooling water to the Peach Bottom nuclear power plant upstream in Pennsylvania. And it provides drinking water to Chester County in Pennsylvania and flood control for the Susquehanna. It also provides a supplementary water supply to Baltimore. We had talked about this a couple of weeks ago. It is a conduit from the river called the Big Inch. It's 38 miles long. It goes to the Montebello treatment plant on Baltimore's east side. And the city used this supply in 2002, which was a drought year, and the city's reservoirs were quite low. And there are ongoing plans to make this a permanent part of the city's water supply system. Here is another view of the Conowingo, an aerial view from above, and the water upstream of the dam is known as the Conowingo Pond. It was originally built by the Philadelphia Electric Company, and through various subsidiaries and mergers, it's now operated by the Susquehanna Electric Company, which in turn is owned by the Exelon Power Corporation. And it currently contributes an average of 1.6 billion kilowatt hours to the electric grid. So the first 5 miles of the Conowingo Pond are in Maryland. And and it is used for recreational boating and fishing, like many other reservoirs. Also, people like to fish below the dam, as you can see in this picture. It's a catch and release fishery, and people have been known to catch up to 100 fish a day during a spawning run. But you need to know one thing if you're going to be fishing in this spot. When they are about to release water from the dam, you have only a few minutes to get out of the water before the river starts rising. There is a siren or a flashing light on the dam. That means get out ASAP, because the river can rise as quickly as 10 feet in 10 minutes when they open the floodgates. The Susquehanna below the dam, because of all the fish, is a good place to watch certain birds. This is a, convocation of bald eagles below the dam. And there is a very large population, permanent population there. And apparently there is also a migratory population that stops there on their way south because the fishing is so good. There was an article in the paper just last week about this, and there was a picture that I thought was really cool. That apparently people go there not just to bird watch, but to take, close-up pictures of the birds. And this is a picture that someone took of a bald eagle at Conowingo carrying a fish that it caught. So in September of 2011, there are 53 floodgates, and they opened 44 of them because of the impact of Tropical Storm Lee. The large amounts of water they had to release had a negative impact on the bay, bringing down a large amount of sediment. It also lowered the salinity in the bay because of all the fresh water, which helped to reduce the diseases that attack oysters. But of course, the worst impact was on towns that were flooded. And one of the worst was Port Deposit, which is just 6 miles below the dam in Cecil County. Port Deposit is on a narrow strip of land between the river and some bluffs behind it. It's flood prone. They had to evacuate it during this storm, but as you can see, it left severe destruction behind it. One of the industries in Port Deposit is a granite quarry. It's provided granite for many buildings and bridges in our area, including the Naval Academy, Fort McHenry, the US Treasury Building, and in another part of the country, the Boston Public Library. So going further down the river, just below the mouth, is an area called the Susquehanna Flats, and that's this area in green and pink. Pull up the map. It is a shallow area just below the mouth, and the water depth here averages between 2 and 5 feet. At one time, the flats, as they call them, were completely covered with underwater grasses. During the 1960s and 70s, because of pollution and other factors, they declined, but lately they've been making a comeback. And what these grasses do is provide cover for both fish and ducks. So this is an excellent fishing and duck hunting area. And in the Decoy Museum in Havre de Grace, there are a number of exhibits about duck hunting on the flats. And this is one of the pictures from the museum. It's people in something called a sink box boat. And they are getting ready to hunt ducks, which don't seem to mind being very close to these hunters with their guns. So now we're going to talk about one of the fish in the Susquehanna River, the American shad. This is what it looks like. Its scientific name is Alosa sapidissima, It's a species of herring, and Alosa is a genus of herring. But Sapodissa means very delicious. And if you've ever had shad, you will know how it got its name. It's a species of river herring. It is anadromous, again, meaning born in a freshwater stream, swimming out to sea to become an adult, and then returning to the native stream in the spring at spawning time. After spawning, the adult shad return to the sea and migrate north to summer feeding grounds near the Gulf of Maine. And each river along the Atlantic coast seems to have a separate population of shad. They call them river-specific populations. At present, there are 3 main rivers in Maryland that support viable populations of American shad. In addition to the Susquehanna, the Nanticoke on the eastern shore, and the Patuxent. Well, in earlier times, shad were much more abundant, but the Conowingo Dam, and there are also 2 dams further upstream on the river, have severely impacted all the migratory fish species in the river, especially the American shad, which would swim all the way upstream in the river to spawn. Historically, American shad, they assume, spawned in just about every river and tributary along the Atlantic coast, all the way from the Bay of Fundy in Canada to the St. Johns River in Florida. And if you are interested in fish or fishing, I recommend this book, or if you're just interested in American history, or if you just like reading books by John McPhee. He writes about how important shad was as a food fish in colonial times. George Washington apparently took thousands of pounds of shad from the Potomac River. But because of dams and other impediments, as well as declining water quality and overfishing, American shad has been depleted. It's making somewhat of a comeback, but nothing like what it used to be. One solution that they are trying to get around, so to speak, the problem of dams blocking the fish's spawning runs is a fish lift. The first thing they tried was at Conowingo was to capture the fish and truck them upstream above the 3 dams on the river and release them. But apparently this didn't work too well. And this is what they have now. A fish lift where the fish swim into a collection channel and are raised by a kind of elevator and then swim out up the river. In 2016, when the dam's license was up for renewal, Exelon Corporation agreed to increase the capacity of the fish lift. And advocates for wildlife say that the number of migrating shad in the river could grow to 2 million over the next 50 years if conditions are right. So that's the story of shad. And also along the river is a state park, Susquehanna State Park, on the Harford County side. It is between Havre de Grace and Conowingo. And this is one of the buildings, an old grist mill in the park, the Rock Run Mill. It was built in 1794, and it's an actual working mill. And on summer weekends, they have people demonstrating grinding corn into cornmeal, and they give the cornmeal away to park visitors. The park also has a section of an old canal, the Susquehanna and Tidewater Canal, which was in operation from 1836 to 1889. And there are other historic buildings in the park, houses, barns, a toll house that was used to collect tolls for a covered bridge that used to cross the Susquehanna there. And they have this little museum called the Stepping Stone Farm Museum. It's a private museum, but it's in the park. And it's about rural life in Harford County in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. It has a furnished house, which is what you see in the picture, a barn and other outbuildings, and a shop where you can buy handcrafted items. And it's also used as a wedding venue. And if you use it there, you have what's called a rustic farm wedding. So as we saw from the map, the Susquehanna gathers most of its water from New York and Pennsylvania, but all of its outflow goes into the Chesapeake Bay. And this is a picture of a poster that I found. I'm not sure what the connection is between a saved bay and a better economy for Pennsylvania, unless cleaning up the rivers of Pennsylvania will bring tourism, people boating and fishing, as you see in the picture. But that's what they are promoting. And because the river flows through 3 states, the 3 states, together with the federal government, formed an interstate compact to cooperate on river problems. It was adopted in 1972, and it created the Susquehanna River Basin Commission. And this is their headquarters in Harrisburg on the river. It is designed to be flood resistant so that all inhabited floors and utilities are above the record flood level. And so you can see this part of the building is, and I don't know what's down here, but probably something like a garage. The flood level was from Hurricane or Tropical Storm Agnes in 1972. And one of their projects is something called the Susquehanna Flood Forecast and Warning System. It's maintained and operated by an interagency committee, which includes the National Weather Service, the U.S. Geological Service, the Army Corps of Engineers, and agencies from the 3 states. And they basically try to provide a warning system when floods are coming up. There's another big issue involving the Susquehanna, which I don't have time to go into today, but it has to do with sediment coming down the river and building up behind the dam. And this has been building up since the dam was built, and it's now reaching a critical stage where they're worried about it starting to overflow the dam and into the bay. And it's a complex problem with no obvious solutions, but a number of proposed solutions. And I think I will maybe put some, I'm planning to send you all a bibliography with some books and websites at the end of the class. And maybe I will find something where you can look up this issue if you want to know more about it. So that is our journey down the Susquehanna. And we'll stop here and I'll ask Mary Lee if there are any questions or comments.
Yes, there are. Okay, John Meredith has a comment about shad, if there is time. And then Michael Baker commented, one of the most popular projects of the Army.
I'm sorry, Mary Lee, can you repeat John's comment again?
Okay, John says he has a comment about shad, if there's time.
If there's,
And then,
okay.
if there's time. And then Michael Baker commented, one of the most popular projects of the Army Corps of Engineers is either fish ladders or lifts.
Okay.
So they're the 2, okay?
And yeah, let's let John make his comment.
Very briefly, so there's a tree that grows in the woodlands around here that's known as the serviceberry, and it's known colloquially as the shad bush. It's a small tree. It blooms in April, early April, before any other leaves are out or any other flowers are out. And it's allegedly named because it blooms when the shad are running. So it's called the shad bush. So look for white flowers out in the woods before the dogwoods come out.
Yeah, thank you. I know about that, but I don't know. It'd be interesting to see if it still works. Because of, climate change, a lot of things are happening at different times than they used to, but thank you, John. Okay.
And can't have about 1 million bones in them.
Yeah, that's true. If you, the best way is to try and find a store that will sell you pre-boned shad, but it is quite delicious. Okay, that it? Okay, we'll go on to the Potomac. Potomac River. This is the watershed, a map of the watershed. Potomac is also a Native American name. And the most likely meaning, they think, is something like landing place for goods, suggesting that the river was a trade route even before European settlement. So the Potomac, it's sometimes called the Nation's River. This little square down here is Washington, D.C. The Potomac flows through the city, or along the boundary of the city, actually. And the river is 383 miles long. It flows through Maryland, Virginia, and West Virginia, as well as Washington. But the watershed actually extends up into Pennsylvania, and you can see up here the sort of beige area here, or the yellowish area, is the part of the watershed in Pennsylvania. And it extends way down into Virginia as well. There are tributary rivers down here that flow north into the Potomac. It crosses all 5 geological provinces in Maryland, starts up in the mountains, flows through the Piedmont down here, and then this part of the river, the tidal part, is in the coastal plain. At the mouth of the river, it is about 6 miles wide. And this is the first bridge crossing the river, the Harry Nice Bridge. It is about 40 miles upstream from the river's mouth. And here the river's only 2 miles wide, easier to build a bridge. Harry Nice was a governor of Maryland in the late 1930s. And the bridge carries US Route 301 from Charles County in Maryland into Virginia. It's the only bridge across the Potomac in the 100 miles from the river's mouth to Washington, D.C. And here is the geology map again, and you can see how the Potomac River goes from the Appalachians up here through the Ridge and Valley province and the Blue Ridge, the Piedmont, and then this part of the river, the lower Potomac, is in the Atlantic coastal plain. The average daily volume of water flowing past Washington, D.C. is about 7 billion gallons a day. And they take the water supply out of the river. We'll take a look at that a little later. And typically, when a river divides 2 states, West Virginia and Virginia, in this case from Maryland, the boundary line runs down the middle of the river. For instance, the Hudson between New York and New Jersey. But because of the way the Maryland Charter was written, the Potomac is located entirely in the state of Maryland. So the boundary with Virginia and West Virginia is not the middle of the river, but the river's southern bank. And as we'll see, this has created some interesting issues throughout the time since Europeans have been here. Because the river flows through all of the geological provinces in Maryland, we'll look at it in 3 parts: the lower, the coastal plain, the middle, the Piedmont, and the upper, the mountain part of Maryland. So the lower Potomac starts in Washington, flows through Charles County and St. Mary's County, and well, I guess Prince George's, then Charles, then St. Mary's, and empties down here into the Chesapeake. This is the portion of the river below the fall line. So the river is an estuary. It's a wide, slow, and tidal river. It's good for navigation. And in the early years of European settlement, it provided bountiful seafood, especially fish and oysters, including those huge takes of shad in the spring that we heard about from George Washington, who was, of course, on the Potomac in Mount Vernon. As on the eastern shore, there are tidal rivers on the Maryland side, and these are some of them: the Wicomico, the St. Mary's, and the Port Tobacco River. They are relatively short compared to the rivers on the eastern shore. And here is one of the state parks. The St. Mary's River State Park has a lake for fishing and boating and trails for hiking and biking. And this looks like a boardwalk, probably through a swampy area in the park. This is a painting of what the Ark and the Dove might have looked like. The two ships that brought European colonists to Maryland, for the first ones to land in Maryland and settle it. And where they landed was on a little island in the Potomac called now St. Clement's Island. It is a state park now. Also, it has walking trails, picnic areas, and a little museum, I assume in this building here. You can only get to it by water taxi or your own boat if you have one. And the water taxi only runs on weekends and not during the winter, although I looked it up and it said the museum was open. So I guess if you have a way to get there on your own, you can visit the museum on St. Clement's Island. A Jesuit priest who traveled on the Ark wrote in his travel journal about the Potomac River, quote, "Never had I beheld a larger or more beautiful river than the Potomac. The Thames seems a mere rivulet in comparison with it." Well, considering that it's 6 miles wide at its mouth, I guess that's not surprising. So the early history of settlement, European settlement along the lower Potomac is a lot like that of the Eastern Shore. Tobacco plantations with their own private wharves on the river to ship products out and bring products in. And like the Eastern Shore, it was a slaveholding economy. The plantation owners were part of a tidewater society along the river, both in Virginia and Maryland. And there were a number of ferries in those days that crossed the river so people could go back and forth and visit. The most famous Potomac River plantation, of course, is this one on the Virginia side, George Washington's Mount Vernon. His father built a small house here in 1734, and then in 1758, Washington expanded it to the house that you can visit today. Among other things, Washington was a farmer, and he was very interested in his crops, and presumably shipped them out from a dock that you can still see. You can walk down the hill, and there is a dock on the river. And before we move further up the river, a couple of other things about the lower Potomac that I thought were interesting. One is that it supports a fairly large population of bottlenose dolphins. Scientists have seen them lately swimming and breeding in the river, and they estimate there might be as many as 1,000 of these interesting looking animals living in the lower Potomac. In the river off Charles County, in an area called Mallows Bay, which is the reddish, pinkish area on the map, right here, There is a large fleet of sunken ships. And this is what they looked like before they were sunk. It was ships we built for our European allies during World War I, but they were never used. And they were eventually scrapped, burned, and sunk right here in Mallows Bay. There are some other wrecked ships here also, and it is the largest ship graveyard in the Western Hemisphere. The sunken ships have also created a marine ecosystem. They provide a lot of places where marine creatures can hide and breed and so on. And the NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, recently designated the area a national marine sanctuary. And if you go there at low tide, you might see something like this. It's one of the ships sunk in Mallows Bay. So the head of the navigation on the Potomac was around Georgetown. And this is a house from the early days of Georgetown. It's still there. It was built in 1765. Today, Georgetown is a fancy neighborhood in Washington, but it started as a port city where produce from the interior could be shipped out on ocean-going ships, and ships could also bring in imported goods from Europe. The city of Georgetown was founded in 1751, and it was an independent city until 1871, when it became part of Washington, D.C. There was another port town across the river in Virginia, and it was called Alexandria. So the lower Potomac ends around Washington, and this is where the river changes character. And before we go on to the middle Potomac, I will ask Mary Lee if there are any questions at this point.
There are, let's see, there are three. Okay. Michael Baker, he said just drove over that rickety old bridge yesterday. I think that was, he was referring to the Harry Nice Bridge. They're building a new bridge with multiple lanes right next to it. Then Mary and Ed asked about the bottlenose dolphins. Are they saltwater or fresh?
Well,
Michael Baker, oh, go ahead. Okay, then one more.
I mean,
Okay.
the lower Potomac has salinity because it's tidal, but it's not as saline as the ocean. So they are, I guess, they are adapted for moderate salinity, but not quite as saline as the, I don't know if they're exactly the same species that you find in the ocean or not. That's an interesting question. I will see if I can look it up.
Research. Okay, then Michael Baker has another comment. When I was a kid, my mom would take me on a day trip to Mount Vernon and Marshall Hall on the SS Mount Vernon. Oh, Marshall Hall was an amusement park in Charles County. Oh, that's interesting.
Okay, thank you. Michael, are you talking about the Harry Nice Bridge, the rickety bridge?
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah, I know every time I go over there, over that old thing, I hope it doesn't fall in while I'm going over it.
well, maybe that they'll
Well,
get some money
it's
from
not-
the infrastructure bill.
It's only one lane each way, and you know, sometimes it's an efficient trip over. Yesterday it was not, because there were a bunch of
People coming back from,
bunch of semis going over the thing, and they go over that bridge really slow.
oh, okay, and they're probably putting a lot of weight on it too.
Yeah. Which
Okay,
makes me more worried about it falling down.
okay, thank you. So the middle Potomac River is the part that flows through the Piedmont province, which is mostly Montgomery County, which is here, and Frederick County. Part of Frederick County's frontage is in the Blue Ridge and part is in the Piedmont. This is Frederick County up here. So The problem here was how to get boat traffic beyond the head of navigation at Washington, D.C. At the fall line, which divides the Piedmont from the coastal plain, and you can see it in red on this map, the falls create barriers to navigation. In the 18th century, George Washington and some others thought there was a potential to provide transportation to the Midwest if they could make the river navigable up to the Ohio River. Of course, one of the problems here is that the Ohio River is on the other side of the Eastern Continental Divide, and you have to cross a mountain to get to it. But there are 5 sets of falls on this section of the Potomac, and each one creates barriers to navigation beyond George Washington. They are Little Falls at Washington, Great Falls, and this is a picture at Great Falls, which is about 14 miles further up. Then Seneca Falls further up, and 2 more sets of falls near Harper's Ferry. Great Falls is the biggest challenge with a 77-foot drop in elevation. And to bypass it, you would have to cut through a steep cliff. George Washington and others created a company called the Potomac Canal Company to build a bypass around this and the other falls on the river. But the work went slowly. They had problems with a labor force, and at that time, there was also a lack of engineering expertise in the country. The Potomac Canal, well, one of them, known as the Great Falls Skirting Canal, was opened in Virginia at Great Falls in 1802. It helped bring traffic down the river, and it was in use for a while, but the company never made any money. And this is a lock that is still there. And there is a Great Falls Park in Virginia, where you can see this, and you can walk a trail called the Matildaville Trail. Well, Matildaville was a town that grew up along the canal. So that was not too successful over the long run. But the next one it was much more ambitious. It was the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. And of course, from the name, you can tell what the ambitions were. To provide access all the way from the Chesapeake Bay at the mouth of the Potomac to the Ohio River system. Well, again, there's no direct connection to the Ohio River or its tributaries. You have to cross the mountain divide to get to them. But it was built on the Maryland side of the river, starting in Georgetown and running for 184 miles, ending in Cumberland, Maryland, where the last section was completed in 1850. But at Cumberland, the builders gave up and the canal never went any further. The C&O had 74 locks and 11 stone aqueducts, like this one, to carry the canal across the tributary rivers. This is the one that carries the canal across the Monocacy in Frederick County. These aqueducts were handsome engineering structures, and many of them are still around. You can still see them. This is the longest of the stone aqueducts. The canal company also built dams along the river to make sure there was a reliable supply of water for the canals. This is one of them, dam number 5. It is at Canal Mile 106. The markers are from starting in Georgetown going up. And there's another one nearby, dam number 4. They are owned by the National Park Service, but leased to the Potomac Edison Electric Company, and they generate power for Washington, D.C. So the canal was built mostly to carry freight, especially wheat and coal. It also carried passengers, and this is a picture we've seen before. It's a packet boat, meaning it had regularly scheduled service on the canal. But eventually, the canal had competition from the railroad, both for shipping freight and carrying passengers. And a series of floods in the 19th century damaged it, and each time required expensive repairs. In 1889, damage from a flood caused the canal to go into receivership, and it was taken over by the B&O Railroad, which was its main competitor at that point. The next major flood was 1924, and at that point, the company decided not to repair the canal, but to close it permanently. Well, in 1938, the US government bought the abandoned canal and put it under the National Park Service, which was going to restore it as a recreation area. World War II postponed this project, and after the war, we were doing major highway construction. Congress was interested in developing the canal and its towpath as a parkway road. But some people were against this idea, the most famous of whom was Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas. He was a lover of the outdoors. He was familiar with the canal. And when the Washington Post wrote an editorial in favor of the road project, Justice Douglas invited the editor of the Post to join him in walking the length of the towpath. The editor accepted, and in March 1954, Douglas led an 8-day hike of the towpath from Cumberland to Washington. And here is a local paper about the hike going on at the time. There were only 9 men who completed the full length of the canal. One of them was Justice Douglas. But popular response to the hike and its press coverage turned people against the parkway idea. And in 1971, the canal was designated a National Historic Park along its full length from Washington, D.C. to Cumberland. And so it is today. There are 6 visitor centers in the park at Georgetown, Great Falls. This is the one, an old tavern along the canal. Brunswick, Williamsport, Hancock, and Cumberland. And visitor centers all have displays and interpretive exhibits about the history of the canal. At one time, they were offering canal boat rides, starting in Georgetown and at Great Falls Tavern. At present, they seem to be unavailable because of ongoing reconstruction to the locks. But the canal park is a very popular place. People use it for hiking, biking, and birding, and access to the Potomac for boating and fishing. And the towpath is a hiking and biking trail for the full length of the canal. Hopefully the canal boat rides will be back one of these days. The Middle Potomac also has the river's only working ferry. White's Ferry connects the town of White's Ferry in Montgomery County to Virginia near the city of Leesburg. But at the moment, there is a dispute going on and the ferry service is not available. They have closed it. The owner of the landing place in Virginia claimed that something, I'm not even sure what the dispute was about, but he withdrew his permission to land there. And then the ferry changed hands last year and negotiations are going on with both Montgomery and Loudoun County in Virginia involved. So hopefully they will work it out and they will bring back the ferry, which gets quite a bit of traffic when it is operating. So that is the Middle Potomac. I'll stop here for questions before we go on to the Upper Potomac. Mary Lee?
One comment, let's see. Michael Baker, again, because of the falls on the Potomac and the Savage River in Western Maryland, this area has become somewhat of an epicenter for Olympic kayakers.
And there's another place we'll talk about next week. Well, the Savage River, but also the Youghiogheny River, the upper Yaak,
Okay.
is also a place for kayaking. Yeah.
And Michael has another comment. I took my boys on the C&O Canal boat ride. back in the day, in quotes. I forget which hurricane knocked the canal out.
Okay, okay. Hopefully it will be fixed one of these days soon.
Well, they don't seem to find the money,
Oh.
they try to appropriate the money and
Huh.
it doesn't happen. It's too bad. I mean, it was a beautiful,
Yeah.
beautiful little thing.
And kind of a little trip into history.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, the Upper Potomac. And this is the mountains, as they say, the mountainside of Maryland. It's actually includes Washington County, which is not on this map, and Allegheny and Garrett. The largest town in this area is Cumberland, which is right about here. And it's the largest town on the Potomac above Washington, D.C. This is a bridge. It's been painted blue since it was built, so it's a tradition to keep it blue. They call it the Cumberland Blue Bridge. And when you walk across this bridge from Cumberland, you are in West Virginia. A few miles south of Cumberland, near the town in West Virginia called Paw Paw, the Potomac has a series of very deep loops called meanders. You can see them at the bottom of this map, like down here. Here we go, like that and that. And they are known as the Paw Paw Bends. Geologists don't all agree on what caused them, but one theory is that it has to do with the underlying rock being shale, which is easy to erode. So to avoid having to build the towpath all along these bends, the builders of the canal tunneled into the rock, and they created the dotted line here shows where the towpath would have been if it had, or the canal would have been and its towpath if it had followed the river. And here is the tunnel connecting point A to point B. The tunnel is 3,000 feet long. And if the towpath had followed the course of the river, it would have been 5 miles long. There's also a walkway alongside the tunnel. And here is a picture of one of the tunnel's entrances. You can walk through the tunnel if you're visiting this section of the canal. But if you do that, you should bring a flashlight, because when you get to the middle of the tunnel, it is completely dark. And just to let you know where the name Paw Paw comes from, this is a native tree. It's one of the only native trees that actually has edible fruit. And it is called the Paw Paw tree, which I assume is a Native American name, but I don't actually know that. So the canal ends in Cumberland. And just beyond the end of the canal is the Visitor Center and Museum, which is in the old Western Maryland Railroad Station. It has exhibits about the history of the canal, the boats, the families, and coal mining. And this is an exhibit that shows what an interior of a canal boat might have looked like. And the family actually lived on this boat, so it had to have a kitchen and various facilities. Further up on the Potomac is a lake called Jennings-Randolph Lake, formed by a dam. Jennings-Randolph was a senator from West Virginia. It is about 40 miles downstream from the river's source, and it was started in 1973 and took over 10 years to build. It's used mainly for water supply for Washington and flood control on the upper Potomac. And Washington is 200 miles downstream from this lake. It's also used to improve the water quality in the north branch of the Potomac, which is contaminated from old coal mines, creating high sulfuric water, running into the lake and into the river. So what reservoir managers do, because there are different layers of water that settle, they can release water from the clean layers and keep the high acidic water above the dam. And it has returned fish life to the North Branch. Here is someone who caught a fish there. And we are now going to look at some interstate disputes about the Potomac. This is a map of Maryland showing its boundaries. In the original charter of 1632, from Charles I of England to Cecil Calvert, Baron of Baltimore, the colony's borders were further south, north, east, and west of where they are now. There were a bunch of disputes and Maryland lost all of them, I'm sorry to say. But the disputes over the western and southern boundaries had to do with the Potomac River. The river was the boundary with Virginia and later West Virginia when it split off from the top. The Tidewater part of Virginia during the Civil War. The boundary was supposed to extend to the headwaters of the river, but which branch of the river? This is the North Branch. This is the South Branch. Maryland claimed it was the South Branch. Virginia claimed it was the North Branch. They had a boundary commission in the 19th century that ruled in favor of Virginia. Maryland eventually took its case to the Supreme Court, but in 1910, the court affirmed Virginia's claim. So this has officially been the southern border of Maryland, in Western Maryland. Legally, I guess, since 1910. The narrow neck of Maryland here at Hancock, where the state's only about 3 miles wide, is the outcome of the boundary dispute with William Penn. The original charter said that the border was to follow the 40th parallel of latitude, which is about 15 miles north of this line, but that went right through Philadelphia. So they had a discussion and Maryland agreed to bring the line back down 15 miles to where it is now. And because the river arcs up, it's only about 3 miles from the river to the boundary line at Hancock. And if you're interested, this history comes from a really interesting book I read, How the States Got Their Shapes. And it's all about all the boundary disputes and other things that happened to create the lines that now exist between the states of the United States. So again, as we mentioned, the original, well, we're not there yet. The original charter of Maryland showed that the state boundary was on the Virginia shoreline. One dispute with Virginia led indirectly to the Constitution. After the Revolution, each state was levying taxes on commerce passing through the state. Maryland wanted to tax ships going to Virginia ports on the Potomac, and Virginia said in retaliation they would tax ships going through the lower Chesapeake. Well, they got together, they worked out a compact, which took place at Mount Vernon, that the waterways would be considered a common highway free for use and navigation of any vessel belonging to either state. This conference became a model for interstate cooperation and eventually led to the forming of the Constitutional Convention in 1787. A more recent dispute was with Fairfax County in the 1980s. They had a water intake pipe in the Potomac and said the water was becoming too muddy. They wanted to extend the pipe to the middle of the river. Well, Maryland said the sediment in the water was the result of Virginia's lax control over its shoreline development. So they took it to the Supreme Court and they ruled in favor of Virginia. And as with the states that share the Susquehanna Basin, the states that share the Potomac have formed a compact to deal with issues that affect them. It is the Interstate Commission on the Potomac River Basin, or the ICPRB, and this is their motto: watersheds cross political boundaries, that's why we're here. It was created in 1940. Its members are Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Washington, D.C. And of course, Pennsylvania being in the watershed, even though it is not on the Potomac. So one of the functions in a commission like this is to do research and make information available. They have a website with a series of maps, and this is one I found interesting. A land use map of the entire Potomac watershed, wooded areas, agricultural areas, and urban areas. And you can see that it has something to do with the topography. And what kind of problems does the commission deal with? Well, the water supply of the Potomac is an ongoing problem to provide adequate water for the Washington metropolitan area. The average daily withdrawal from the river at Washington is 391 million gallons. The flow in the river varies by season, but the average flow is 7 billion gallons a day. But when the river is low, flows can be very close to the daily withdrawal. In fact, the drought of record, which was in September 1966, was 388 million gallons a day, which, as you can see, is a little less than the actual current water demand. In 1963, the Corps of Engineers came up with a water supply plan for the watershed, which included 16 large reservoir dams and 418 smaller headwater dams throughout the basin. And this was the plan of the Corps. And if they had done this, most of the Potomac above Washington would have been a series of dams and lakes. A lot of people saw the river as a scenic and recreational resource, and they protested this. So the Interior Secretary was asked to make a comprehensive study of the river, and they specifically recommended against major dams on the river. So the only two that were built in the end, one on the river, which was the Jennings Randolph, way up at the upper Potomac, and then a second one on the Savage River, which is a tributary of the Potomac. There is a entity called the Section for Cooperative Water Supply Operations on the Potomac River, COOP for short. They monitor for drought conditions and coordinate water resources among the water utilities in the Washington area. The compact was amended for ICPRB in 1940 to address water quality issues with waste treatment standards and standards for stream cleanliness. But I came across an academic paper prepared by the College of Agricultural Sciences at Penn State, and it stated that the Potomac Commission was relatively weak in comparison to the Susquehanna Commission and others, which had more enforcement authority. Also, a few years ago, some members of the Virginia legislature introduced a bill to have Virginia withdraw from its membership on the commission and not pay its share of the funding. Incidentally, or maybe not, the commission's headquarters are in Rockville. As of now, the Virginia effort seems to have been defeated, but we'll see. So that is the story of the two big rivers that affect Maryland and other states. And they have all kinds of issues and problems and solutions. So now we will stop for any further questions. Mary Lee?
Just one from Deborah. It's a comment. The pawpaw is the only understory tree that deer will not browse, and is often the only understory tree species that survives in these forests due to overpopulation of deer.
Wow, that's really interesting. I wonder why that is. Deborah, do you know?
I have no idea. There may be something, a lot of plants have things that are in them that sort of repel animals that want to eat them. So there may be something acidic or slightly
Yeah.
toxic.
I wonder, being a native plant, if it somehow evolved to avoid being eaten by deer.
Too bad all the other species haven't.
Yeah, well, I mean, introduced species obviously have not,
No, but all the others.
and the deer just gobble. I read that they don't browse beech trees also, and that some forests are now mostly beech trees because of it.
Yeah, beech trees are not an understory tree.
Oh, well,
They're a canopy tree.
yeah, right. Okay. Michael has his hand up. Go ahead.
If the some years ago, a few friends of mine and I bought a piece of property out in Garrett County, and one of the streams that flows into the Potomac is Glade Run out there, and that was on part of our property. It was really pretty. You know, it was trees over. We have mountain laurel and rhododendron and things like that. And I went down. The water looked really clear, and I took a taste of it, and then it was awful.
Yeah.
So the next time I went up there with my boys, we drove north to find out what was going on, and we found this big, ugly strip mine. That was just awful. And you know, you talked about Maryland owning part of the river. This was kind of interesting. I had a friend, my best friend in high school, had relatives in Colonial Beach, Virginia, which is across the river from Charles County. And in Maryland, we had legal gambling with slot machines in Charles and Calvert and St. Mary and Anne Arundel County. So what the people in Colonial Beach did was they extended their pier and they built a casino out on the end of the pier, on the logic that
it was in Maryland.
Well, you know, we're in Maryland, you know, so we should be legal. But the next summer I went down there and we didn't see any casino anymore because Virginia had taken steps to shut that down. But I thought that was pretty interesting, using this sort of logic about the high water mark.
Yeah. Anybody else?
2 more comments. John Meredith just asked, do you know about the old casinos on the Potomac?
Oh, God. Yeah.
That one.
Judith Campbell commented that pawpaws are delicious.
Yeah.
And Marion Ed said, excellent presentation, Judy.
Thank you. Michael, have another comment before we go?
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't put
Oh,
my
you
hand
didn't
down.
lower your hand. Okay. All right. Well, next week we will finish up with the rivers of Western Maryland. And one of the things we'll talk about is mine drainage and something that they are trying to do about it. So maybe we can clean up your stream up in Garrett County. And we're going to have a special presentation by a member of our class who knows something more about rivers than I do. Okay, we'll see you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judy.
Thank you.
This has
Thank
this has been a great class. Thank you
Great.
so much.
Yeah.
Thanks, Judy.
And happy Hanukkah, Judy. Have a good week.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Okay.
happy Hanukkah.
Hey.
Hanukkah. Yes, thanks, Judy. Happy Hanukkah.
Thank you, thank you.
Happy Hanukkah to you and to everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Judy, there were 33 in the class today.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I don't know where,
Bye-bye.
I don't know where
Bye-bye.
everybody else was. We had 60 people sign up and we
Oh,
never had anyone.
They are swimming in the lake.
Bye-bye.
They're taking the polar bear plunge.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's right.
right. That's right. Yeah. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.